Hey folks, Michael Mann from Michael Mann Security Services. Welcome to webinar number 8, Protecting Houses of Worship from Terrorism. Hey, before we get started, let's get the admin stuff out of the way, the fun stuff. All right. So if you want to contact us, get us at michaelmannsecurityservices.com. You can give us a call at 615-606-1006. That's Scott's cell phone number, as I tell you guys. He'll take your calls anytime. He loves to be waking up at 6 o'clock in the morning or 2 a.m. He'll answer the phone anytime. He's a glutton for punishment. You can get a hold of Scott, SCOTTM, at michaelmannsecurityservices.com. Or you can always contact us at contact@michaelmannsecurityservices.com. And, of course, you're on our Facebook page now at Safe with Man. Let's talk about some things coming up before we get into this webinar. So we're doing webinars every week, lots of good information. Try to make them under an hour to push information out to you guys quickly and efficiently because we know you're busy. Next week's webinar, same time, same location right here on the Facebook page. It's going to be protecting high-risk pastors or religious leaders. And so we're going to get into where close protection comes into protecting pastors and religious leaders. So this is where like executive protection kind of starts to mesh in to your physical security program at a house of worship. So again, that'll be probably another hour webinar, 45 minutes to an hour. It's another popular topic. So if you've got a pastor that's high risk, you've determined they're high risk based on a threat assessment, you're at a very, very large church like a mega church, or if they're a lightning rod for just controversial information, or they preach the Bible and people like to hear it, and they've received threats, this can be a really good webinar next week for you guys to sit through. We've got some training on the webinar coming up, or training coming up. Go to our training page. You're going to see we've got Israeli Security Concept training class, one of our most popular classes for churches. We're about to hit that online also. We've got some weapons classes coming up and some other exciting stuff. So just go to the training page or training tab, and if you're in the Middle Tennessee area or you're within driving distance, that's some really good stuff, really inexpensive, and it's fun. Okay? All right, we'll get started here real quick, go over what we're going to talk about, expectations. As always, folks, this is a little bit longer. We have some more information. This is a popular topic. So this is going to be 45 to 50 minutes. Normally we try to do this in about 30 to 40, but we've got a little bit more information in this webinar. This is a general overview of terrorism. I can't squeeze 30 plus years of anti-terrorism experience into 50 minutes. I'm going to try to, but we're going to just provide a general overview for you, number one, on what terrorism is, what that looks like. Number two, how it impacts the church. And then number three, a strategy for you guys that you can use once you cut this webinar off or we shut down and you go back to services on Sunday. Hopefully some of you folks are back in service. If not, that's coming up soon, it looks like, around the country. So maybe another month of streaming for you guys, and then you're going to be back physically protecting your houses of worship. So again, general overview, trying to give you as much information as we can. We're going to do a detailed case study, ideological terrorist threat. The reason why we're using the case study we're going to talk about is because it's one of the few that I can find when we start talking about adversaries in churches where we have a lot of information, because he was actually stopped in the act, was arrested, was charged and convicted with terrorism-related offenses, and so we have a lot of information about the case study to break it down for you. Then again, of course, we're going to do the strategy and path forward for you guys, 6 to 8 little tips that you guys can use when you go back to protecting your house of worship or your facility. And then we have a Q&A at the end. If you don't have any questions, you don't have to ask anything, but at any time you can email a question, or you can send us one through the Facebook page. Scott's monitoring Facebook for us right now, or you can wait till the end, and at the end we'll answer those questions. So Scott can read those questions out to me, and I'll answer as many questions as I can quickly to get you guys out of here on time. Okay? All right. So let's get into this. Let's talk about terrorist attacks in houses of worship. All right? So we'll go ahead and get to this. So let me tell you where I got the information on the attacks. The rest of this stuff comes from study and experience that I've been involved with since the late 1980s, because I'm old. But the statistics on the attacks, let me tell you where that comes from. That comes from the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism. That is out of the University of Maryland at College Park. They have a lot of online resources, to include a global terrorism database that breaks down attacks. So there's a lot of good information on there. So that's where the information about the attacks is coming from. So if you ever want to visit that website, you can just type in START and then Global Terrorism Database, and that'll come up. That's a free resource you can use. And then if you go to that page, there's a lot of free resources on that page also. So some good stuff for you guys to use for references. Also, let me tell you what we omitted, what we took out. And so there were like 9 to 12 attacks that were listed in this database. And this is, I think it's 2017, 2018, 2019 terrorist attacks on religious facilities or houses of worship have not been posted yet because I'm assuming they're still gathering that information. And so what we did, well, what we omitted, so what we did not include were arson attacks where no suspects were identified, no arrests were made, and a group or individual did not claim responsibility for the attack because we really don't know if it was a terrorist attack or not. And so because of that, we omitted that. So we get this from the Global Terrorism Database from START, that information on attacks, and then we omitted or we did not include about 9 to 12 arson attacks that they had listed. And that's because, again, no one was arrested, nobody claimed responsibility. So we don't really know what the cause of that attack was. So we took those out. Okay? All right. So hardest thing to always do is define terrorism. So let me give you the easiest definition of terrorism that I can give you. Now, if you go to the FBI's webpage, you go to DOD, you go to Department of State, they all have definitions for terrorism. They might fit into your space. They may not. So the easiest definition that I found was when I was studying several years back to the Center for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence out of University of St. Andrews. And so this is the easiest definition for me, number one, to remember, and it just fits into everything. And terrorism is the systematic use of violence and intimidation in order to achieve political and social aims. And I will write that down or take a snapshot of this if you can, because this is going to be a point later on when we get in the case study. Okay. So again, you can look up the definition of terrorism. You're going to get all kinds of definitions. Some can be confusing because terrorism is a very hard thing to define. But this is the easiest definition for me to remember, and it kind of fits into everything that we're doing here. Okay? A couple things again. I'm going to show you this in the case study. I keep going back to the case study, but again, what we're going to provide for you in that case study is it circles back around to all this to prove what we're talking about is true. So just some characteristics to think about when we talk about terrorism. Number one, acts of terrorism are premeditated, they're planned in advance. If you guys have listened to the other 7 webinars, especially when we talked about the mindset of the active shooter, we talked about armed security teams, I continue to go back to this, what I call an adversary attack methodology. Some people call it a pathway, depending on what threat assessment process you've studied or been certified on, and some people call it like a cycle. Either way, there is this process that they follow, any attack. Whether it's a terrorist, an active shooter, it could be a sexual predator. They're going to follow this cycle or something very similar. And so just like everything we've talked about in the past, acts of terrorism are premeditated. They are planned in advance. Cool thing about that is, and we're going to cover it, if you're a church protector, if you're on a church security team or ministry, you can see this if you get trained to do that. Okay? Acts of terrorism are intended to influence both political and social behavior. So we've got 2 parts here. We've got the political piece and then the social piece, depending on what's going on in that region or that country. And again, we're going to get into that. Terrorism aims to affect audiences beyond the immediate victims or targets. So when we talk about threats, we talk about intentional threats, we talk about natural threats. There's also inadvertent threats, and inadvertent threats, those things we cannot plan for. That's where we talk about peripheral targets or peripheral threats. And so what we're talking about here is, even though the church, one church, may be the target, they may be the victim, the act itself is intended to affect other audiences, maybe other people of that faith, maybe people of other faith. So it's intended to affect them and change behavior in the way that people do things and the way they think about things. And again, we're going to show you this in the case study. So again, everything is pre-planned, premeditated and planned. We've talked about that before with other attackers or adversaries. This is based on the influence for both political and social behavior to change it. And then, of course, it's aimed to affect audiences beyond those victims. And we talk about those threats. That's going to be an inadvertent threat of those peripheral threats. Okay? All right, so again, you guys, we talked about where this information came from. So let me kind of go through what we got out of the database. So you can see this on the slide here. So from August of 2017 through November of 2018, when we talk about houses of worship or religious institutions in the United States of America, when we omit those 9 to 12 arson attacks where there was no suspect, no arrest, nobody claimed responsibility, there was no evidence of who did that, who the adversary was, these attacks involved, and the victims were synagogues, mosques, and Christian churches. When we start talking about methodologies or what they did, what the weapons used, what the method of attack was, so there was one vehicle-borne attack, and that was an anti-Semite who decided to attack a synagogue after some sort of an event at the synagogue. There were people coming outside. It was a family event, and they used that vehicle to run over several people that were coming out of the synagogue to injure those folks. There were two armed attacks. One of the armed attacks was about 10 miles from here. So we're in Brentwood, Tennessee, which is just outside of Nashville. The armed attack I'm talking about that happened about 10 to 12 miles away from here was in Antioch, Tennessee, conducted by an Islamic extremist. I think he killed 2 to 3 people and seriously injured a couple. There was a bystander inside the church that actually tackled the suspect or the adversary, and then the adversary ended up having a negligent discharge and injured himself, and they held this person dead until the police got there. And because this was way, way out, almost at the edge of Davidson County in Metro or Nashville, it took the police an extended amount of time to get to the shooting. I remember that day well because we were standing post at, we're at a very, very large church. I direct security for a very large church here in Brentwood, and then we have a Franklin campus also. And I remember that day because the Brentwood police officers that we have directing traffic contacted us, hey, there was just a church attack in Antioch, and then we were trying to get details of that information from that attack. The second armed attack was in a synagogue in 2018 up in Pennsylvania. You will remember that, another anti-Semite that walked into a service and started shooting, ended up barricading himself. It was an assault, ended up barricading himself. 4 police officers show up. They make entry to neutralize the adversary, and he shoots those 4 police officers, I think seriously injuring 3 of them. It took them an extended amount of time to get the adversary out of the building and get him into custody. There were a couple of incendiary device attacks, and they weren't anything nothing fancy, and so it was like Molotov cocktails, homemade incendiary devices, and so obviously the method there was used to try to start a fire or try to burn that facility down. And then there was arson. And again, the victims were synagogues, mosques, and Christian churches. So when we start to talk about risk, we look at these attacks. From 2017, August 2017 to 11/2018, we talk about risk, and you guys have heard this before. And so before I say this, something I always tell you guys in every webinar or every seminar that we do, look, terrorism is something that is a church protector, whether you're a volunteer or getting paid. It should be in your threat spectrum. That threat spectrum is, again, that thing that you're trying to protect the church against. But understand, even though it should be on your threat spectrum, based on numbers, and we're going to go over that here in just a minute, that probability is very, very low. So we talk about risk, again, we're talking about probability, we're talking about vulnerability, and we're talking about consequence or impact. And so that probability of a terrorist attack at your house of worship is going to be low, and the way that we, again, try to zip that up and keep that from happening where we are, even though that's a low probability, is we figure out what our vulnerabilities are, and then we address those vulnerabilities, because we really can't change the consequence. So when we get into risk, remember, there's over 300,000 Protestant churches in the United States of America. So from 2017 to 2018 with those 10 attacks, if you just look at Protestant churches, and I think really it's over 350,000, then when we look at all the mosques, we look at all the other religious institutions or facilities or houses of worship, we're probably talking up 800,000 congregations or more in the U.S. And so when we talk about 10 attacks in that, year and 3 months, again, we start talking about numbers and probability. It's very, very low, but it is something that you probably need to address and think about. Is it something we need to be standing on the roof with overtly with shoulder fire weapons? Absolutely not. Should you be putting vehicle barriers up at your church? No, you should not be doing that. If it gets that bad, just stream the service, okay? But it is something that you need to address, because this is something that you do need to put in your threat spectrum, even though that probability is very, very low. So let's get into, and again, this is an overview because I want to get, number one, to the case study and walk you through that process, and then I want to also get to the strategy for you guys. So let me classify real quick terrorist organizations or groups for you if you haven't had any kind of study or you don't know much about this. So you're a volunteer, you're a volunteer leader, you're trying to figure out how you're going to plug this into your protection strategy, and you want to know this without having to spend money or spend a lot of time on magical Google. All right, so first classification is national terrorists, and that's generally they seek political self-determination. They claim to be the authentic voice of national culture. A good example, especially if you're older, a nationalist group that everybody knows about, or most people I would assume, is the Irish Republican Army. So terrorist organization that was actually developed back or started back in like 1917, initially not as a terrorist organization, but if I remember my studies correctly, it was started for Irish citizens who did not want to volunteer and fight in British service in World War I, and then it turned into what it turned into. So nationalist terrorists, again, seek political self-determination. They claim to be the authentic voice of some sort of national culture where they're coming from. So that's the first classification. Second classification, sorry about that, is going to be ideological terrorists. They seek to change political, social, and economic systems either to an extreme left or an extreme right model. Some examples are going to be like neo-Nazi groups. One I've put on here because we're going to talk about a little bit here later on is the Japanese Red Army. If you've had anything else from us, especially if you've had our Israeli security concept class, you remember that the Japanese Red Army was behind the attack, or they're the adversaries of the attack on the Lod Airport in Tel Aviv in May 1972. Where a number of Israelis were killed, where they were able to sneak weapons onto the plane when they got off, because they were disguised as musicians. They got off, they opened the cases up, and they pulled the weapons out, were able to attack the airport. That is what actually shifted the Israelis from profiling to actually looking at signature and addressing what we call now the Israeli security concept. So neo-Nazi groups, Japanese Red Army. Our case study today is going to address an ideological terrorist, and not anything more than for the reason of we've got a whole lot of information, and there's a lot of information to for me to show you what that attack cycle looks like. Okay. Then the other classification is religio-political terrorists. They're extreme groups made up of militant fundamental factions belonging to several major religions, to include Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus, etc. When we think about religio-political groups, we're talking about like Al-Qaeda, Hamas. And so something that you guys, obviously names that you guys remember now, it's especially as Americans, that's kind of bored into our brain because of 9/11. So obviously Al-Qaeda, the adversaries that attacked us on 9/11, Hamas, in modern times I think probably one of the greatest adversaries to Israel. So again, religio-political, when we think about those folks, we're talking about groups like Al-Qaeda and Hamas. And then we go into single-issue terrorists. These are folks that are terrorist groups that aim to block a specific policy or practice within their target society. They often combine terrorist tactics with less violent forms of protest. And we're talking about like violent animal rights or anti-abortion groups. So like the Animal Liberation Front and Defensive Action. If some of you guys have been around terrorism for a while, especially some of our folks that are joining us from the Fusion Center, you guys will remember the group that was led by Dr. John Britton. Or I'm sorry, it was a group led by, sorry, the name is fled me now, but they killed two doctors, Britton and Barat, just outside of an abortion clinic in Florida. And then, of course, there's a picture here. This is a funny picture, but this is the Animal Liberation Front. So this is a terrorist organization that will use terrorist tactics to try to target society. And to try to get you to buy into what they propose. And if you look, this is like a scary photo until you add the dogs. And so you've got like this terrorist organization with masks on, and of course, because obviously they're pro-animal, they're the Animal Liberation Front, they're against the cruelty for animals. Then they've got these photos of these beagles. So it's kind of a funny looking picture, but this is something that they've posted for social reasons. Okay, and then the last group, and then we're going to get into the meat of the presentation, which is the case study, so you guys start to understand this, and the strategy is going to be state-sponsored terrorists. And so state-sponsored terrorists is where the state is involved, either overtly or covertly, in trying to achieve its political agenda through terror, usually in a third neighboring state. And so when we think about like state-sponsored, think about Hezbollah, so sponsored by Iran, and then constantly attacks Israel. Anyway, and then, so those are the groups, all right? So let me, and if you need or you have questions about those, please send those to Scott. I want to get into the meat of this presentation because this is what's going to take the time, and this is what you came here for. I just want to give you a general overview of terrorism. So let me talk about quickly, so before the case study, and you guys have heard this from me before, requirements for conducting a successful attack. So I don't care if you're an 18-year-old Lance Corporal in the Marine Corps, you're a terrorist, you're an active shooter. You don't really have to have any training to pick this up because by nature we're sinful, we're fallen. That's obviously that's the reason for Jesus Christ. So understand a terrorist can receive very little training and planning to conduct that successful attack and still be successful, but there are some elements that are required for this. Okay, you guys have heard me say this before. We go all the way back in the book of Genesis. Cain killed his brother Abel with a rock. He went through a process. He was angry. There was a grievance because he believed, and it was true, that there was favor on Abel and not to Cain because of an offering issue. God very specifically told Cain what the issue was. He knew that Cain was mad. Cain continued to be upset and mad because his brother continued to have favor with God, and then Genesis specifically tells us he led his brother Abel out into the field and he killed him. He went through this process. Okay, so let me get into this. So first requirement, and this gets into the case study, is I must, or the adversary must, have information about the specific target. And today what that means, it could mean online resources. So we have ISIS that sends out magazines to its followers to tell those followers or those folks that want to be the adversary how to conduct successful attacks. It could be on-site surveillance. The great thing about when the adversary has to gather information about us if we're the target is the volunteer church security ministry or team can see this if you are trained to do it. And we're going to get into that. So I've got to gather information about the target. I can do that through online resources. And I also need to go on site to take a look. And again, we're going to get into that. Number two is we need the element of surprise. This is the big issue with active shooters in churches, schools. It's no one's expecting it. The bad guy needs to surprise us. The target has to be unaware of the threat while the adversary, what we call, hides in plain sight. And this is the hostile surveillance piece. This is when we're gathering information about the target doesn't know we're there or doesn't know the adversary is there because they don't know how to detect surveillance. Surveillance, again, gathering information about a person, place, or thing. The difference between regular surveillance and hostile surveillance is gathering information about a person, place, or thing for the purpose of conducting a successful attack. So we want to keep the element of surprise down, and we do that by maintaining situational awareness. That takes away the element of surprise. And that happens, we hope, while the adversary is gaining information on the target. We see that 3 weeks, 3 months, 3 years before. Mobility. So when we start to talk about the assault process, if I'm going to conduct an assault, whether I'm a Marine in Fast Company, I'm a SWAT team member, I'm protecting a nuclear site, or I'm the adversary, I have to do a couple of things. And that means I got to gain entry. For the churches, that's easy. I've got to get in and control the situation. At some point, I got to get out if I want to escape. But while I'm doing this, I've got to be mobile. I got to be able to move around. So once he gets in, and for churches, it's easy because we want folks to come in. The adversary is able to penetrate the protected space and close distance with the intended target. So they've got to be mobile. Okay. So again, I've got to gather information. Okay. I've got to have the element of surprise. And once I get into that intended target, when I penetrate that space, I've got to be able to close distance with those victims or those intended targets. And so I can do exactly what I came there to do, which is conduct that successful attack. And then I have to control the situation. And if you've seen with these church attacks, and we talked about the 10 attacks very quickly at the beginning of this presentation, that is with the use of firearms, explosive, or other lethal weapons. Primarily, as you saw with the church attacks, we did have 2 attacks with firearms, but the other attacks were with the use of explosives. And again, it might not have been with a full IED where you had to have a switch, you had to have an initiator, you had to have everything, a case where you had to have, or a container where you had to have everything. It could have been something as simple as a Molotov cocktail. All right. So I've got to gather information about the target, and the cool thing about that is we can see that when they're gathering information. That's the element of surprise, and if we're doing our job as protectors, whether we're volunteers or getting paid, while they're gathering that information, we can see that, we can detect it, and we can take away that element of surprise. Mobility, if they do get in, then they have to be able to close distance with that target, and they got to do that by moving around. And then, of course, they have to control the situation, and that is with weapons. Anytime we take, as protectors, if we're able to take any of this away, then the attack cannot be successful. And if you look, those first two elements, that is where we're going to be successful. It's when we see the information being gathered, and because we see that and we go up and maybe we address it, if we're able to go up and conduct a quick field threat assessment, then we can possibly take away that element of surprise, and we psychologically impact that adversary's motivation to go attack somebody else. That's the goal. Okay? So those are the requirements for conducting a successful attack. If you've been to our training here, if you've heard me online before, I continue to preach this and talk about it, because just like any kind of weapons training or anything else we do, it's about repetition. You need to burn this in your brain if you're a volunteer. This is what you're looking for. You're trying to see when they're gathering information, and you want to take away that element of surprise. And here's why. If they get into your space and they go to control that situation, so if they're mobile and they have weapons inside your space, you are at a tactical disadvantage. I don't care how many people you have. I don't care how many guns you have. It is very difficult to be able to stop that adversary. You're having to conduct an assault, even though it's an immediate response. Conducting that assault and stopping it can be very, very difficult, and when we do, most of the time it's luck. Trust me. Okay? All right. So let's get into a case study real quick. We're 25 minutes into this. I want to keep this on time because we're getting into strategy. We're going to talk about Floyd Lee Corkins, who attacked the Family Research Council in Washington, D.C. So our adversary was an ideological terrorist threat. Mr. Corkins was caught on the scene. He was tackled by kind of the security and facility guy. We're going to talk about that. He was arrested. He was charged and convicted with terrorism-related offenses, and then a number of weapons offenses, and then also attempted homicide. And so he was a pro-LGBT activist that decided to attack this Christian ministry. Now, the Family Research Council is very open and overt about their beliefs in the family and about gay marriage. Obviously, it is a Christian organization. And so the headquarters was located in Washington, D.C. And so Corkins decides he wants to attack an anti-LGBT facility or organization. So what he does is he starts conducting online research and pre-attack surveillance on the target. He does an attack rehearsal to include firearms training that he received after he purchased a firearm to conduct the attack. The initial plan was to actually conduct a bombing attack, but he later told police he didn't have the patience to do that. Okay, probably patience and resources. You can run into a problem if you don't know anything about explosives, and you happen to pick up a magazine or go to YouTube and try to build a bomb, and you don't know what you're doing. It could be a self-correcting error very, very quickly. Okay, so let me walk you through the timeline of what happened. So this goes into, number one, all these attacks, like any other attack, are pre-planned or they're premeditated and are planned always. There are four elements that are always necessary. Number one, again, I got to gather information. I have to have the element of surprise. I have to be mobile, and I have to control the situation. So here's what happened during the attack. So the attack happened on August 15th. So here's what happened. On August the 7th, 2012, after doing research on what target he believed he wanted to attack, he starts to search online for weapons. Now, he lives just outside D.C. He lives in Northern Virginia. He finds a weapons store, a gun store in Chantilly, Virginia. And so on August 9th, he goes into the store and he starts looking around for guns. Yeah, like anybody else, he's kind of walking around to pick out his pistol. He leaves, and then he comes back the next day on August 10th. So he returns to the gun store and he purchases the handgun. It was a SIG P229. He purchases ammunition and then an extra box of ammunition, an additional 50 rounds. And because he bought a gun at this store, it's a really cool store. So if you buy a gun from them, they give you 2 hours of gun training for free. So he gets to rehearse right there where he's buying the weapons system. On August 12th, 2012, he visits the Southern Poverty Law Center's website. After doing some other research, he identifies and he validates that Family Research Council as being anti-gay. Now, he also looked at 3 other advocacy groups that were tied to FRC as additional targets of opportunity. Okay, so this is all from the 7th to the 12th, and before the 7th, he was also conducting online research. August the 12th, here's his rehearsal. He prints MapQuest and Google Map directions to FRC and one of the other advocacy groups. On the 13th, he actually makes the journey to the target and he conducts pre-attack surveillance. Now, here's what he learns. The primary target, FRC, has hardened security measures. We're going to talk about this in a second. Guns do not stop, they don't stop attacks. Hardened security procedures do not stop violent attacks. They do not. They only provide a delay, and then the weapons only provide an element of response. And we're going to talk about that. He sees that FRC has hardened security measures, and he is not deterred. And what I mean by hardened security measures, they have access control on the door. You just can't walk in. There's a lock on the door that you can't pry it with your hands. You couldn't even probably pry the door open. And you have to buzz in and identify yourself before they let you in. So he's not deterred. So what he does, he conducts some probing and rehearsal, and he does gain access. He through ruse, he gains access to go in. Once he gets in, he asks for somebody, I believe, that didn't work there. He goes in, he sees how easy it is to get through those hardened measures, and then he leaves. On August 14th, 2012, he purchases 15 Chick-fil-A sandwiches, and the idea behind the Chick-fil-A sandwiches, because, of course, the Chick-fil-A restaurant chain is associated with Christianity and with anti-LGBT issues, and so his plan was to kill everybody that he could inside the FRC facility and then rub those chicken sandwiches in their face. August 15th, so now he's conducted all of his intelligence. So he has gathered information about the target online, and he has physically conducted his on-site hostile surveillance. He has gone through the process of it's the element of surprise in his probing and in this surveillance mode to go in and probe and rehearse. He was able to get into the target, and they had no idea that he was going to attack. So element of surprise. Conducts that pre-attack surveillance to gather information, and now he has also gone in, gotten that information, and they have no idea he's an attacker, so this attack's going to be a total surprise to them. Now he's going to get in, he's going to breach that protected space, he's going to be mobile, and he's going to control the situation of those weapons. So on August the 15th, he takes the Metro to the target, just like he planned to do a couple days before as he walked through the rehearsal process. He's armed with that P229 6-hour handgun, 50 rounds of ammunition, the sandwiches, and the names of 4 additional targets, just in case he's not successful at FRC. Using deception, again, he gains access to the lobby a second time, and he approaches a security guard. Now, there's a guard, so what happens is he approaches. This is kind of a security guy, and he's also like a facilities guy. So he's kind of in charge of the facility, and he's kind of doing security work. He walks up, he starts talking. I think he says he's there for an interview. The person starts looking to see who he said he's supposed to interview with. That person doesn't exist. And then the adversary pulls the weapon out of his bag. The guard sees it. So the guard now jumps and grabs the weapon. And to stop that mobility, he tries to control the adversary. The security and facility person is shot 3 times. But even though he's shot 3 times, he is able to get Corkins on the ground. He is able to get the gun away from him, and he is able to subdue him until police arrive. Okay? So he was able to take away the control, and he was able to take away mobility. Now, the goal would have been, of course, to take that away, to take that element of surprise away, and to see him conduct his pre-attack surveillance, but they weren't able to see that, okay, based on their configuration. And so he was able to take away those 2 elements, but again, when we do that, more than likely somebody is going to be harmed. In this case, it was the guard that was actually able to stop it, but he was shot 3 times, and he was able to survive. This is a video, you'll be able to hear it. This is the interview with law enforcement, and he's very specifically saying, they're asking him, why did you conduct an attack on this facility? And very plainly he says, well, you know, they're anti-gay. I did some research online. I kind of rehearsed it. And so this is a quick video that gets into that. So this is the actual interview, just a very quick segment of when he's being interviewed by the police.
This building.
So, how'd you know about the building, the organization? How'd you find it? Did you look it up online? And then, of course, he says, yep, Southern Poverty Law Center. It's an anti-gay group. I found them online. I did a little bit of research, went to the website, stuff like that. Okay, so again, it's validating what they probably had guessed before after they took them into custody. So this is this planning process we're talking about. Again, when we talk about the adversary needs to gather information about the target, they need the element of surprise, they've got to be mobile once they enter that protected space, and they have to control the situation with weapons. We want to stop it in those first two elements, because if they get inside, if they actually if they're able actually to penetrate into our protected space, they're mobile, they have access to our targets or to their targets, which is our assets we're protecting, and they have weapons, more than likely people are still going to die or at least get shot. And that's not protection, that is actually response. Okay? All right. So to keep us on time, let's talk about our strategy real quick. We're at 16:34 or 4:34. We're 34 minutes into this. Let me give you a quick strategy of things that you can think about and things that you can implement. All right, so number one, here's what I want everyone here to remember as Americans. We live in the greatest country in the world. We were founded by very great people. We live in a republic, somewhat. Okay? So understand that protecting your house of worship is your responsibility. It's the responsibility of the congregation, the security ministry, the security safety team, whatever you call yourselves. The police of the government will not and cannot provide physical protection for you. Here's why. Number one, it's not their responsibility. Look up DeShaney versus Winnebago County, and there are a number of other case study or case law that you can come up and see. The Supreme Court, since the 1980s, have ruled on this several times. The police are not here to protect the citizen from any type of personal violence. Number one, it's not their responsibility. And number two, they don't have the ability to do it anyway. Number one, because there's not enough of them. And number two, look, and again, nothing about police officers. I was a police officer for 10 years after I got out of the Marine Corps, was a full-time SWAT officer, did a lot of training on my own. But my ability came from training that I paid for on my own. The training that was provided for me through the police department, and this is around police departments around the country, and I can say this because I've trained police officers throughout this great country in counterterrorism and active shooter response. The training that they receive does not provide them with the skills and the abilities most of the time to stop these attacks. Number one, because there's not enough of them, they can't get there on time. And number two, if they get in, it's a stronghold assault. They're not trained to do that. They're going to take casualties. You've heard this from me before. When the police arrive, it's a terrorist attack, it's an active shooter, whatever. If they gain entry and the adversary is in the target conducting the attack, police officers take a 46% or more casualty rate when they go in. Look at the attack in Pennsylvania on the synagogue that we mentioned at the first presentation. 4 police officers went in. Those 4 police officers were seriously injured. There are public and private partnerships and programs available, and I'm going to talk about that as part of the strategy. So it's your responsibility as a citizen to protect your house of worship, but there are some public-private partnerships available, and we're going to get into that. Going back to the case study, when we talk about protection, the attack ended before the police were even notified. The attack started and it ended before the police were even notified that it was happening. And it was rehearsed, it was surveilled, the target was surveilled, and the police and the government knew nothing about it. They cannot protect us, and it is our job to protect our churches. But here's the cool thing about this wonderful country that God has given us. There are some resources out there we can use, and again, we're going to go over those in just a minute. Know your adversary. Number 2, know your threat spectrum. If terrorism is on your threat spectrum, which it should be, remember low probability, figure out what your vulnerabilities are, seal those up so we lower our risk score, because the consequence is always going to be higher critical because of the impact of this. The adversary is always going to follow this, what I call the adversary attack methodology. Here's the cool thing about that. Those elements, if you are trained correctly, are easily identifiable by volunteer security team members. And if you see those elements early, you can conduct a field threat assessment, or what some people call a snapshot risk or threat assessment. Folks in the executive protection world, folks a lot smarter than me, you can conduct that and you can convince that adversary possibly not to attack your facility. Volunteer security teams have been and can be successful in deterring attacks. You can do that as a volunteer. But remember, we're staying in the first 2 requirements of that successful attack. While they're gathering that information, so we can take away that element of surprise. We don't want to do it once they get inside there. Once they get in with a weapon, they have control, they have mobility. It's going to be very hard for us to stop it. Most of the time, it's luck. So know your adversary. Get the correct training, use the resources that you can. Gather intelligence from open source networks. Folks, this is important. I talked to a very nice lady before the presentation from a fusion center, probably a God thing because I had stuck this in there. I'd actually added this morning when we talked about strategy. And then I get a call from this nice lady from a fusion center somewhere. So this is something you need to use. A fusion center is a team effort of local, state, and federal law enforcement personnel in cooperation with citizens, us, the private sector, for the timely receipt, analysis, and dissemination of terrorism information and criminal activity. Here I've got relating to Tennessee, but it could be any state. So find out, so if you're on a volunteer security team, contact your fusion center and find out what open source resources they can provide for you. They've got a lot of information. I designed and developed anti-terrorism programs for the chemical industry, and I designed physical protection programs for the nuclear fuel industry for several years. And I was connected to the fusion centers because I wanted information. Those are private industries, and even though we had classified information and other items on our sites, and even though we had a clearance for our facility, there was still information I didn't have available to me. So I would link up with a fusion center to conduct threat assessments because they could give me information. There were a number of my sites that came under hostile surveillance, both nuclear and chemical sites. They were detected by our security personnel because we were able to implement this Israeli security concept at these facilities. Stuff I learned when I was studying in Israel. They were able to pick up a hostile surveillance, and I reported that through these fusion centers, and we got a lot of good information back about those potential adversaries. There were a couple times when you get information because we knew it was hostile surveillance, and they covered the tracks, but there were a lot of times where we were able to actually solve something because we reported that through the fusion center. They sent that information out. Police departments in other states were able to go to those folks that we thought were conducting surveillance, interview those folks, and we got those results back. So contact your local fusion center and find out what faith-based security initiatives they have for you guys. And it's free. It doesn't cost anything. Most of it doesn't. Your local JTTF, that's a Joint Terrorism Task Force. They're busy folks. That is a group of both FBI agents and local police officers, especially if you live in a big jurisdiction. They have information. They gather information. When I work criminal intelligence here in Nashville as a investigator, half my time I spent on ideological threats here, terrorist threats, very specifically anti-Semites, and then anti-government folks. We went through the JTTF to gather information. Back then it was actually called something else. This is prior to 9/11. It wasn't as big as it is now, but we went through those groups to assist us and help us. If you're in a big jurisdiction, you have a local police department, they have an intelligence section, they might be gathering the same information. They might be willing to share information with you. When we look at our case study, the Family Research Council is very open regarding their opposition to gay marriage. Local law enforcement resources may have the ability to intercept threatening behavior or activity that could impact your house of worship. I don't know if DC Police or the JTTF or any kind of fusion center that was in the D.C. area was sharing information with the FRC at that time about anything, or if they would have known anything about this attacker. But it might have been a good idea for them to do that, and it's a really good idea for you folks to make contact with those fusion centers and those local law enforcement officials and get all the information that you can get to develop your threat spectrum and know your adversary. All right, prevention is the key to success. As protectors, the goal of the security ministry, you've heard this from me before, is to make it difficult for the adversary to succeed. Prevention has nothing to do with weapons, folks. And I'm not an anti-gun guy. I'm a 32-year student of Colonel Jeff Cooper's modern technique of the pistol. I teach the modern technique, a student, a teacher, a practitioner. Man, we teach a lot of weapon stuff. I develop armed teams for large faith-based organizations, small faith-based organizations, large companies. So I'm not against guns, but I'm telling you, the way that we stop these attacks is not with the guns. You're going to respond with a gun. It's through intelligence and deterrence. That intelligence can come from these fusion centers, and the deterrence comes from you and your security teams understanding what you're looking for. In the case study, the adversary was able to penetrate the protected environment because of the lack of security design, and we'll get into that. So there were hardened measures, but any physical protection system can be defeated. Our company's name is Michael Mann Security Services, but actually we are Masada Consulting. That is a Jewish fortress in the Judean desert. Go do your homework on Masada. That is fortress in Hebrew. That was a wonderful physical protection system, but eventually it took 4 years. It was defeated by the Romans or by the Roman army that was trying to make its way up to kill the Sicarii there in Masada. So any physical protection system can be defeated, including locks, cameras, vehicle barriers, whatever. So it's about gathering intelligence and providing deterrence, psychologically impacting that adversary's motivation to attack your house of worship. Okay? Understand your environment. I hear all the time, especially after an active shooter, we hear a lot of law enforcement folks and other folks come on board about like pre-attack indicators and that looks like. A pre-attack indicator for a criminal that's going to steal a car or break into a house is different than that active shooter or that terrorist. So you need to understand as a church protector what is the norm in your facility, and you're going to have to survey if you don't know what that means. What is the baseline? It's not just about a backpack. It's not just about somebody maybe concealing a weapon. It's about behavior. It's about attire. It's about personal belonging. It's about the context of everything that you gather about everybody that comes inside your protected environment. That takes some training, okay? So that starts with a survey of understanding what is normal and what is abnormal. The adversary in the case study was able to deceive the security guard twice, during the rehearsal the first time and the next day during the actual attack. What was expected and what was not. If somebody went up and buzzed the door and said, hey, I'm here for a job interview, and he didn't know, and again, I'm not blaming FRC, please. That guy was a hero. He was able to stop that adversary and save multiple lives, but you need to understand your environment and what should be expected and what is not expected. That's going to help you understand, as you start to gather intelligence, maybe where you need to go the next step, which could be a field threat assessment. Okay, physical security design strategy, protect the church without hardening. Folks, you've heard me say this before, the most important physical security design feature for churches, or two of them, concentric rings of protection, and number two, conflict avoidance. Conflict avoidance is our security program does not conflict with the mission of the organization we're protecting. The mission of the church is to get out there and tell the world who is broken just like us, who is sinful, who is going to be separated from God when they leave this horrible place that we live in now. Our job is to get them inside that building. And so here's what we don't want to do. We don't want to lock doors. We don't want to make them feel like they're coming through a TSA security check. We want them to be welcome. And we do that without locked doors, without physical barriers, without inspections of hand-carried items. We actually do that through gathering intelligence and deterrence. We talked about in the case study. The adversary, who was very dedicated, was able to defeat a hardened structure just by lying, just by probing and getting in. We are looking, number one, to keep the church open, to keep those people to get them inside. Get those people to come inside, hear the good news, while at the same time we're out watching to keep them safe. Okay? So we call this secure by design. It's concentric rings of protection. It is the perception that the adversary can be seen. It doesn't matter if you don't see them. If you're out doing your job on post, practicing concentric rings, they might think that you see them. So their cover story is blown. This can psychologically impact their motivation to attack your house of worship. Case study, the adversary defeated the access control measures using deception. Again, the hardened measures didn't work. Okay? All right. I've been talking about this. We've been talking about how you do this. So very quickly, we do this on Zoom. This is coming up. So June 21st, 2020 on Zoom from 1400 to 1700 or 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. Central Standard Time. We're going to teach the Israeli Security Concept Phase 1. It's going to get into teaching you how to understand your environment, what kind of survey to do, what that looks like, the history of the concept, and this does come from Israel, a big part of it, threat indicators, threat identification, what that looks like, and how to psychologically impact the adversary's motivation to attack your church. You're going to see that on our webpage. We're going to blast that on our Facebook page tomorrow once we get that posted on Eventbrite. So it's very inexpensive. Jump on there if you can. We're going to get into how we do this by design without locking your church down and trying to keep the folks out of the church. We don't want to do that. We don't want them to feel like they're coming through a TSA checkpoint. We want them to feel like they are welcomed, they are loved. That's exactly what the church is for. Okay? All right, folks, we're at 48 minutes. I said 45 to 50 minutes. Very quickly, I want to get to a Q&A. I don't know if we have any. Scott, do we have any questions? No, none. Hey, look, at any time, shoot us an email. Let me get to that real quick. Website, michaelmannsecurityservices.com. You can get us at scott.m@michaelmannsecurityservices.com, or you can get us at contact@michaelmannsecurityservices.com. You can send us a question at Safe with Man on Facebook, or you can get us on Instagram also. But if you ask us a question on Facebook, it'll come to our phones. We'll see it. If I see it or Scott sees it, we're going to immediately answer that question, or we're going to answer it as fast as we possibly can. Or you can give us a call, 615-606-1006. That's Scott. He loves to talk to people, especially at 2 a.m. in the morning. Okay, folks, thanks again for joining us today. Again, next week, same time, we're going to get into protecting high-risk pastors or religious leaders. So this is how we start to tie in executive protection or close protection operations into your physical protection program. Most churches around the country don't need this, but there are some that watch us that do because they're mega churches, or they have pastors that talk about controversial subjects and they're threatening, so they're high-risk personnel. And so we're going to get into that next week, okay, from 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. Central Standard Time. And remember, folks, just like we talked about today, it's about prevention, not response.